Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our chats with Emily, as we are calling our readings through the poetry of Emily Dickinson. We are in the Johnson edition, and we turn now to a little poem, number 360, Death Sets a Thing Significant. We have said already in earlier conversations about Dickinson that she is at the same time so unbelievably specific, and yet at the same time also so unbelievably universal. This is a classic example of what we mean. In this poem, Emily will be dealing with something extremely personal, but at the same time, she will be dealing with something that we can all identify as quite universal as well. Remembrance. It's a poem about how we remember those we have lost, and it is death that makes that loss so unbelievably significant. When it was published in 1891, it was titled Memorials, and it makes sense that it would have been called that. The challenge of this poem is we don't know exactly who it is that she's referencing or what book it is that she's referencing. Our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at LearnStrong.net down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily, our playlist name. I'm hopeful that you've already worked with our set of introductory comments where we will have mentioned Ben Newton, we will have mentioned her relationship, possible relationship to Ralph Waldo Emerson and the Transcendentalist movement. And I'm hopeful as well that you have worked with our preceding 359 poems. We just finished with 359, I gained it. So if you have, then you know from your reading that Emily was a reader. Now there's been huge debate about what Emily read and how she read it. In this poem, the word will be notched. We, of course, in 303 use the word annotation to talk about how we engage reading through discovery process, through discovery reading. Now, the poem is about reading in one regards, and more particularly about reading a book. The scholar Johnson has pointed out that it is possible that Emily will be referencing a friend of hers, Ben Newton, and a book that he shared of Emerson's poems that will be given to Emily in 1850. Now, Ben Newton had given her the book before his death. It was a well-marked copy, apparently, of Emerson's poems. Newton is the young lawyer apprentice who had been Emily's quote-unquote teacher and died in 1853. The subject is in this poem is the way in which death will, you could use the word italicize or underscore or make significant the passing. It's interesting though the way that she gets us to the notion of reading a book of possibly Ben Newton and his notchings or his annotations. She'll begin with children, then she'll go to a reference to a woman, possibly a friend or a mother who has stitched and that kind of thing, and then finally gets to the book. She says it this way: Death sets a thing significant, the eye had hurried by, except a perished creature entreat us tenderly. To ponder little workmanships in crayon or in wool with, this was last her fingers did, industrious until the thimble weighed too heavy, the stitches stopped themselves, and then 'twas put among the dust upon the closet shelves. A book I have, a friend gave, whose pencil here and there had notched the place that pleased him, at rest his fingers are. Now, when I read not. For interrupting tears obliterate the etchings too costly for repairs. Again, notice the way the poem moves from the general. It is only often in death that we really appreciate the things that are left behind by those we care about who have left us, to the extremely specific, I have a book, and I can't even read this book, because within the book there are these markings made by a friend of mine. And I'm no longer reading the book. I'm remembering the friend. It's brilliant. Now, death, of course, many have said Emily is the poet of death. I think Emily is the poet of life, and by definition, death is a part of that. But death is mentioned in 135 of her poems. So here we go. Death sets a thing, notice capitalized, significant. It is interesting that it's a thing and it's not a person. In other words, we live vicariously when we have lost those we care about. We live vicariously through the things that they maybe left behind. The eye had hurried by. In other words, we had seen it as insignificant, except as a perished creature entreat us tenderly, when we get to poem 441, she'll use this word tenderly, for love of her sweet countrymen, judge tenderly of me. This is my letter to the world. We'll enjoy her use of that word tenderly. To ponder, we've seen her use this word. Little workmanships, now a child, in crown or in wool with, and then notice the quotation marks, this was last her fingers did, end quote. In other words, parents who have lost a child will hold on to the thing that we're most reminded of in the child that we lost. And then we go from there to a woman, a seamstress, a thimble way too heavy. The stitches stopped themselves, and then 'twas put among the dust. Later it will be at rest among the dust upon the closet shelves. In other words, there's this, I can't help but think at 3A of that classic play and short story Trifles. The idea that stitching reminds us that somebody did the stitching. This is why, right, guys, we love, for example, old heirlooms like an old quilt or something. We think of Alice Walker's Everyday Use, don't we? That idea that there's something that was made by someone special, and when we look at that something that was made, it gives us pause. And then, from that general observation, Emily will step to this book, possibly Emerson's poems given to her by Ben Newton in 1850. A book I have, a friend gave, notice all these dashes, right, that will interrupt the flow of her observation, whose pencil, here and there, had notched the place that pleased him. We'll only get this word notched one other time in 788, the depth upon my soul now notched. A mark, right? An annotation, if you will. Now, there's been a lot of talk about Emily and the way she read and whether she annotated. Some believe she would mark with a pencil and an X next to information, but as has been pointed out, lots of people had pencils and lots of people read many of the books that were in the Dickinson house. Had notched the place that pleased him, at rest his fingers are. In other words, she holds this book and she's immediately reminded of her friend, possibly Ben Newton. Now, she says, when I read not. Now, again, one of the reasons we call these talks Chats with Emily is we would love to have some sense of what it is that, how Emily read and why she read and how she annotated and notched and the like. For interrupting tears, obliterate the etchings, and of course obliterate's an interesting word. In other words, it's almost like she can no longer read the words because the words were marked and read earlier by someone she cares about, a pal. In this regard, she says a friend. Too costly for repairs. It can't be rebuilt. What is she saying at 2A? It is hard to remember the ones that we have lost. At 2B, there's amazing amounts of alliteration happening in this poem, right? Had, hurried, workmanship's, wool, with, was, weighed, stitches, stopped, pencil, place, and the assonance as well. Death, sets, I, by. The internal rhyme as well is at play here. There's consonants as well, right? Death and thing in line 1, had, hurried, perished in lines 2 and 3. It's amazing the game of sounds that she's playing here. At 3A, well, obviously, we think of Emerson's poems, yes, as being poetry that was so precious to so many of Emily's contemporaries. Finally, at 3B, what is an object that you have that leads you back to make that individual even more significant? And to what degree are you a reader of volumes that you mark? And you got to wonder who will read your Emily volume that you've marked up long after you're gone. Thank you.